his message from Buckner, and his problem was that nobody believed him. Nobody believed that there really was going to be a surrender. And the thing that was significant that I learned, and I think I'll finally tell you after 3 tries, Grant had issued a warning order the night before, telling his subordinate commanders to be prepared to withdraw to Fort Henry, because he thought it was all over for him. And had he withdrawn to Fort Henry, he would have been killed or captured, every one of them, because they had no boats. Reuben Ross and his pals had blown into smithereens earlier in the week. And so it could easily have sent Grant back into the obscurity from which he came, and we would have never heard of him. But he suddenly was handed the victory that made him forever a hero in the North. And it gave Lincoln the victory that he so desperately needed. So Grant's superiors, Halleck and McClellan, despised him because they remembered him as a depressed, drunken captain out west 10 or 15 years earlier. And they did everything they could to get him court-martialed and sent back to Illinois. But they couldn't, because Grant had a friend in high places named Lincoln. And Grant used his initiative and pleased Lincoln even more by he took Clarksville without firing a shot. Fort Defiance spiked their guns and ran. He took Nashville without firing a shot, and the Confederacy never got it back. And because he had done this without asking permission, they relieved him for cause, which is disgrace, and sent him back to Fort Henry in the mud without a plan. Most people don't know that. And it was during that time that he was back in Fort Henry being depressed in the mud that he was a guest in Jack Henson's home. And the war, as you know, the rest is history, as they say. He was to be court-martialed and sacked out of the Army, but it didn't turn out that way. Henson went on with his life. I think it must be true that at times Grant must have wondered what had become of his friend in Dover, Tennessee, to make him become what he had become, the scourge of Stewart County and the surrounding area. I've never seen anything in writing about that, but it must have crossed his mind at times. Well, as you know, Jack set out to get the vengeance, and by the winter of 1863, the suspicion of him became acute, and it was about to be over. Now, he had freed his slaves in the summer of 1862, before the Emancipation Proclamation, which again, I think, speaks highly of the man in several different ways. He had looked around and seen the slaves that belonged to his neighbors being confiscated by the Army without any reparation or whatever, there's a word for it, I can't think of it. But they were just seized and taken away, and the family that lost them never heard from them, never knew what had happened. They were forced into labor gangs, and in many cases they were mistreated. And Jack Henson didn't want that to happen to his family, and so he realized that if he legally freed them, they would become what was called at the time free persons of color. And it would be difficult, if not impossible, then for the Army to seize them and take them away. And it did indeed work out that he never lost a single one. And at the end of the war, as you probably know, they stayed there, and the row of slave cabins became the nucleus of Hensontown. They named it for him. And people here who are probably 50 or older can remember when Hensontown was what it was, that part of Dover was called Hensontown. He lost his home, of course. Vengeance has a high cost. It cost him 7 of his children, his home, his life as he had known it. They burned the house to the ground in a blizzard and drove his wife and children off. And he loaded them up in a sled and covered them with hay and with a faithful black, two of them, to protect them, took them over the river at Winsbury to Henry County, where they stayed with relatives at Sulphur Wells for the rest of the war. Jack rode off in the opposite direction to protect them, so that if he was being followed, he would lead the troops away from them, and it worked out just fine. But they burned the house to the ground, and he never went back. After the war, he bought another one and paid cash for another plantation on White Oak Creek at a place called Magnolia, and he called it Magnolia Hill. It had also a blacksmith shop, a sawmill, a grist mill, and a country store. And we found a crude little journal of a man who had lived there at that time. It had been thrown out with trash in an old smokehouse. And what a treasure it is, because the man who owned it was one of these people that wrote down everything he did and everything he bought and the price he paid for it. And he'd say, bought from Jack Henson, 1 gallon of whiskey, $1. Bought from Jack Henson, 1 plug of chewing tobacco, 5 cents. To me, it's a treasure, because I didn't know that he operated the country store. I didn't know that he personally had anything to do with it, but he obviously did. He lived 9 years after the war, and under constant threat of being hauled before a military tribunal and hanged. But it didn't seem to bother him. He enjoyed his grandchildren and raised a calf or two and a colt or two, and worked in his country store and enjoyed meeting people who came there. And every time they were just about to get a noose around his neck, he had friends in high places before the war, and he had friends in high places after the war. They would get rid of habeas corpus and rescue the old man, and he would go back to doing what he did. And 9 years later, he died of natural causes. The things he did, and others like him, he wasn't the only one that was roaming the woods as an independent sniper, but he was by far the most notorious. And by the end of the war, the Union had committed elements of 9 regiments, both cavalry and infantry, and an amphibious task force of the Marines with specially made shallow draft, high-speed boats and horses, and they never got him. If you remember the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, you remember how the Pinkertons had a special railroad car made so they could open the door and run out of the ramp, and they were already in the saddle inside the railroad car, and they'd go galloping off after Butch and Sundance. Well, that's the way these Marines were equipped, and that was what they did. They could run those boats up on the mud, and they'd come galloping out already on the horses and go chase Jack Henson and other people like him. But they didn't do any good either. And he and others like him had significant impact on Union policy. For example, there was one period when the Secretary of the Navy decreed that no boats would go south of Paducah on the Tennessee River or south of Smithland on the Cumberland River, because it was too dangerous. They issued special orders how to tie up, if they must tie up at night, and how to keep the guns loaded and trained on the banks, and so forth. He accomplished a great deal, if you want to look at it that way. But when he died, I'll tell this one story. Vengeance, as I said, it has a high price, and it can be passed down to coming generations. I'm not doing this very well tonight, but thank you for being patient with me. His son, Albert, whom he called Ab, was a teenager when the war started. He was the only one of the